Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. I'm president and CEO of Fund the People, where our mission is to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. We give funders and nonprofits cutting-edge ideas, research, and tools to help drive equity, effectiveness, and endurance in the social sector. So let's start the show. Welcome, everybody, to your Fund the People podcast. It's great to have you here. We've got a really interesting conversation for you today. Our guest is Cary Sparrow. He's a business leader and engineer who has taken an entrepreneurial approach to creating some important innovations in tech and jobs. He founded a group called WageScape in 2015 with a vision of bringing transparency to the labor market. And we're going to talk about what WageScape does and what you can get from it today. Prior to founding WageScape, Cary served as vice president at Cargill, the largest privately held company in the U.S., and he was responsible for upgrading the global workforce management infrastructure, including technology, processes, data, and organizational structures. Prior to Cargill, Cary was a principal and global practice leader at Willis Towers Watson. He's also a veteran of the United States Navy, where he served as an officer on nuclear fast attack submarines. And he has a master's in management from the Kellogg School at Northwestern and a master's in systems engineering with focus on AI and neural network control systems. Cary, thanks for being here with us today on the Fund the People podcast.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Great. You're an unusual guest for us here because you're not a nonprofiteer or a philanthropy person, but I'm really glad to be talking to you. Tell us a little bit about WageScape. Why did you start it and what does it do?
Well, we'll start with what it does. We track what's happening with hiring and pay, the demand for jobs, the availability of talent, how much is getting paid and for what jobs on a real-time basis. And that means that we take a look around the world, over 200 countries every single day, and we track as many jobs as we can. In the U.S., that amounts to about 95% of all job openings we track every day. And why do we do that? Because lots of folks need information about what's happening in the labor market, and the other sources of information are collected with methods that are very inflexible, are out of date, are not really that accurate, and measure decisions that happened in the past as opposed to decisions that are happening right now. So when I was at Cargill, I saw how big an impact poor market data had on inefficiency in organizations and saw an opportunity to make a difference on that. And so jumped out and founded WageScape.
When you say the ways of tracking job salaries or other things about jobs are not flexible or are looking back instead of present day, can you tell us more about that problem? What are the ways that this has been done traditionally?
Sure. I'll focus on pay because that's an area that we are particularly good at, is understanding what's happening with pay right now. If you want to know how much to pay a job in your area, there's a few sources you can go to, but where the information comes from typically is a set of tools called salary surveys. And these are surveys that companies fill out that describe for all their jobs or some of their jobs how much they're actually paying their employees. For compliance reasons, these surveys have to be conducted by a third party. Mm-hmm. And the process for collecting that information generally starts in the springtime. It's an annual process. In some cases, it's updated semi-annually, but it typically starts in the springtime. The results are available late in the third quarter. So if you think about that, the data that's being collected in the springtime reflects pay decisions that were made in the last budget cycle. So anywhere from 6 to 12 months prior to then. And by the time you actually see them, there's another 6 months that goes by. And so, you're looking at the results of decisions that are anywhere from 12 to 24 months old, typically. Now, you are looking at what people are actually getting paid, not by name, obviously, but, you're looking at their rates. But that also doesn't help you if you're hiring, because in order to understand what you need to pay, you need to understand what you're competing against. And what you're competing against is not what some other company's employees are actually making. You're competing against what those other companies are offering to pay their employees. So that's where there's weakness in the available data. Now, in the past, it really wasn't that big of a deal. All through my career, the typical wage inflation was anywhere from 2.5% to 4%. It was relatively low, and typically around 3%. And in that kind of environment, you're not changing very much. There's not a lot of volatility. When the pandemic hit, that was completely wrong. There was huge volatility and huge wage inflation that companies were resorting to in order to get the talent that they needed or keep the talent they have from walking down the street to somebody else. And that kind of opened the floodgates, right? There's all kinds of other intelligence you can get by looking at real-time data that I can get into. But as it relates to pay, the market for pay went totally out of bounds in 2020. And as a result, you've got pay situations now that are not predictable and not averageable. So you could see salary surveys or economic surveys that say that wages are going to go up 4.5%. That really doesn't tell you anything actionable. That doesn't tell you what you need in order to hire an HVAC technician in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, what you need to offer to pay them. You need a different source of information on that. And that's how granular things are getting. You have to know for every type of job you're hiring, in every location you're hiring, what's going on with pay in that location, because that's what you're competing against. So companies are getting a lot more sophisticated, and they need more sophisticated market intelligence, and that's what we provide.
That's fantastic. Thank you for the overview. I'm just taking that in and thinking how it applies in the nonprofit sector. And I was just thinking how the data for nonprofits is already in a weak spot because the government Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't really publish employment stats broken out for nonprofits or even types of nonprofits. And so we're sort of invisible in the employment data, which includes aggregate wages, I believe, in congressional districts or states or different industries. And so we already are down for the count on that kind of data. And then everybody has been suffering, I guess, from this sort of 6 months to 2-year gap in information about what people are being paid locally. And then we have the issue in nonprofits that, if you try to find the market rate, it's already depressed. And so then you're creating positions that are underpaying people because everyone else is already underpaying people. So the data I've seen is that we're underpaying by about 30%. If you compare a similar job with similar responsibilities in other industries that are not nonprofits, like government.
It was a similar situation at the start of the pandemic, and then it set the stage for how things are now, where prior to the pandemic, companies, as they were advertising jobs and recruiting people, they didn't effectively market their whole package of what they were offering. Now, I think nonprofits actually do a much better job at this because they're mission driven and the mission comes first. And you know that going into the nonprofit, that's what you're contributing to. And you also know, and nonprofits can say that they're never going to be competitive with the highest wages in the market, right? But as soon as the pandemic hit, it became clear that companies were starting to throw lots of money at people. The majority of companies said, we can't afford to throw lots of money at people and compete. So what did? They started significantly emphasizing their whole package, what it was like to work there, the culture, the benefits that they got. I mean, it's a really noticeable shift that less than 5% of companies included any kind of statement around benefits prior to 2020 in their job ads. And by the end of 2020, that number was over 50%.
Wow, that's a huge change.
They clearly got the message that you got to compete on multiple fronts. And I think nonprofits have been doing that forever. So are clearly better at it, at putting the mission in front. But nonetheless, especially in an environment where we are still feeling the effects of inflation, not just wage inflation, but actual inflation. And folks are a lot more sensitive to what it takes to put food on the table and keep the lights on and a roof over their head. And so, especially with jobs that are perhaps lower paid, the organizations have to be more sensitive to what's going on with actual pay. And there's only so much that you can discount a job and still expect people to come and want to fulfill that job or stay in that job. We saw an awful lot of folks that left their jobs for better opportunities, and that's still very much going on. In today's economy, we've got another set of situations where there's not nearly as much churn in the jobs. as there was. And so I guess the good thing for employers, nonprofit and otherwise, is that folks are much more reluctant to pull up stakes and go take a position somewhere else. And organizations, while they post open jobs, are a lot slower at hiring for those jobs than they were even, a year and a half ago. So things have really slowed down. People talk about kind of the K economy, where things feel like they're going down for a big part of folks. But for folks that are more affluent or higher paid, you're seeing strong indicators in the economy. That's a real issue. And for nonprofits, that has implications for funding, obviously, but it also has implications for how you need to manage your employees. And I think it's bad news in general, but probably good news for organizations that right now employees are generally less likely to leave a job that they have.
Yeah. I feel like every survey of nonprofit workers, people say, yes, I'm considering a new job or I'm considering leaving the sector. But people get frustrated with conditions in their workplaces and with the challenges of these jobs. But there's actually a pretty good amount of loyalty to the field.
It takes a lot to switch jobs. I mean, in the past, the conventional wisdom was people never left for better pay. They always left because of culture or managers or occasionally career opportunities. But even that, it takes a lot to get people to switch. Not so anymore. Folks, I think, are just way more sensitive to ensuring that they have a stable income and that income is going to continue to meet their needs even as prices continue to go up in the country. Mm-hmm. And so you got to stay on top of what the market's paying, and you have to engender trust that you're looking out for your team in every way. But it takes a lot to get somebody to leave, and the worse the economic outlook is, the more likely they are to stay. And I think that's some of the situation that we're in right now. And we're recording this in early February of 2026. By the time the audience is listening to it, maybe things will have drifted one way or another. But I think there's a fair amount of nervousness that is guiding individual employee decisions right now. And I think there's an opportunity for mission to be even more important than it ever has been. And so for those that can take full advantage of and take initiative on the opportunity, I think there's an opportunity to engender even more loyalty among employees and, frankly, among funders and every other stakeholder right now, because it is a much more difficult environment that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think last year we saw more layoffs. I don't know the data per se, but certainly there was this huge change in the environment that had been fairly stable in terms of government funding. And all of a sudden there were all these talented people who, by no cause of their own, were out of work in nonprofits. One of our guests last year said, if funders would step up to support grantees to be able to make hires, there's a lot of talent out there on the market right now.
We're seeing that too. There's a lot of talent in general right now. We're hiring, my company's hiring, and I'm amazed at the talent that we have access to. And it's not that hard to compete for it compared to what it was a couple of years ago. And I think that applies across the board. Also, I think that in general, there's a heightened affinity for people to want to find meaning in what they're doing. Now, that sounds like some airy kind of concept, but I really do think that with the turbulence that we're seeing across lots of different fronts, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, I think folks are seeing that if there's an opportunity to do something that has real meaning for them, that they can still put the roof over their head and food in their kids' bellies.
Right.
That has a lot more appeal than things like career advancement. I think that meaning is overtaking career considerations.
Interesting that you're seeing that. So tell us more about what folks can get from WageScape. Like, what do you offer? How does it work?
We sell our data to other organizations. So we have this massive data set that feeds from nearly 1 million different sources of information every day. It's huge. It's arguably the largest source of real-time market intelligence there is. In some cases, we provide that data to organizations that are investing heavily in analyzing what's going on in the market for jobs they care about. And so these are folks that have invested in analytics teams and strong analytics tools and have the capability to house very large data sets and analyze them using all kinds of data science skills to answer questions that are relevant to what's going on in the market and those insights would allow us to be more effective. So it ranges from really super heavy users to folks that want more specific questions answered. The most basic of which is, what's the going rate for a given kind of position in a given location? And we sell tools that help people figure that out. In between, we also allow people to see things like, how are the skills that are required for certain kinds of jobs changing? Universities, for example, want to know, where should we be investing in curriculum development in a way that we can promote the return on the investment our students are making in their education to help maximize that, as an example. So there's a variety of different uses, but I mentioned that there's lots of stuff you can do when you're tracking information. We get our data nearly exclusively from job listings, which are really well documented. So you see all kinds of information about what's required in a job and what's being offered for the job, educational requirements, skills requirements, and what's going on with flexible work arrangements or not, what's going on with hiring rates for individual companies or sectors of companies. So if you wanted to know, for example, for certain kinds of jobs, like development jobs in nonprofits of a certain size, you can isolate out organizations that match that criteria and look at those kinds of positions and see, is the skills profile changing? Is the pay profile changing? Are they offering different kind of working arrangements? Do those jobs even exist in the same structure and form that they've existed historically, or are there new kinds of developments there? And so there's lots of things you can learn. Our mission is to bring more transparency to it, but there's so much information that's available that if you're like us and can collect and then make sense of it, there's a huge degree of transparency, way more than people realize is available to them. And so it's just a matter of what kinds of questions can you think of that are relevant to you in general, when it comes to things like skills and hiring and pay and, who's doing what. The information's available for that.
One of the issues and controversies in nonprofits in recent years has been about transparency in job listings, in particular about posting the salaries or a salary range, because I guess a lot of organizations were not posting what the range even was. And so people would apply blindly, not knowing what they might make in terms of compensation or salary at least. And some folks started advocating. And then I know there have been state laws that have come into effect to say you have to post.
And country laws. If you operate internationally with anything over in Europe, this is the new reality. If you're in a number of states here and that number is going up every year, you're required to post a range. But even more importantly, candidates are now not even reading ads that don't have a range to them. So the need to do that argument has already been settled in practice. Still, though, less than 30% of jobs actually have ranges in their advertisements. Even in the states that require it, there's a long way to go in terms of actually complying with that intention. And then you get into the very technical question of what constitutes the range that we should use. And for the folks that manage pay for a living, this has been a big deal for the last couple of years. And I think that there's best practices that are now emerging about that. Because originally people were literally putting in the lowest one of their current employees was making to the highest. And that's not what people are putting in for ranges now, although they're being very deliberate about what range they put in. So it took a while to figure out, what do we do with this new set of requirements and what constitutes a range? And I think people are getting smart about that. And if anyone out there wants to talk more on this topic, I'd be more than happy to spend a little bit of time talking to you. If you're not interested in it, I won't geek out on you about this unless you really want to go down that rabbit hole. But anybody who does want to go down that rabbit hole, I'm more than happy to spend time talking about this.
Yeah, there are definitely some people in the nonprofit sector, this is their jam. It's not about how much you pay. It's about tell us what the job pays so that we know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are a lot of organizations, some still, but that were very nervous and skeptical and distrusting of the concept of posting pay ranges, because it really, at the heart of it, it represented a significant loss of control for companies, or they felt that it did, because they were giving up access to that kind of very privileged information. And now that's not the case so much anymore, and I think lots of folks have gotten over that. I think that there's a lot of leaders, managers, organizations that hold on to leadership approaches that they've grown up with, and it's very threatening when those need to change. Remote work's another great example of this, where boy, it seems like lots of folks haven't made up their mind on how they want to deal with remote work.
So
but
true.
There is no question that there is and will be going forward way more remote work and forms of like hybrid work happening now than there was 6 years ago. So I think that horse has left the barn. Even the companies where you see the headlines that they're bringing everybody back to the office, I think they obviously have reasons for doing this. This applies regardless of the kind of organization you have. But it's one of those things, though, where if you've got somebody that has the flexibility to work at home, has the flexibility to handle childcare or elder care, has wardrobe flexibility, doesn't have to worry about commute times and commute costs, doesn't have to worry about wardrobe costs to the same extent. And now you're going to tell them that they have to go back to worrying about all those things and they don't get the flexibility that they want. You're just taking away, back to the point of you've got to lean into kind of the full package that you've got. You're taking away a big part of that package by bringing people back into the office. Now, it may be that you've got the kind of culture where the shoulder to shoulder, all in the same room, real-time communication face to face is important to the culture that you need in order to be effective. But the vast majority of organizations don't need that across the board. Maybe there's some teams that need it, but you don't need it across the board. So yeah, the book on effective leadership, I don't think the principles are changing necessarily, but the practices have been being rewritten for a few years now. And I don't think we're in the first or second inning of that anymore. I think we're in more like the sixth, going on the seventh inning of some of these things. Mm-hmm. But pay transparency is one of them. But I will tell you, if you're a leader of any kind of organization, the more you can embrace transparency, the better it will serve you, because you may think that you have privileged information, but I guarantee you, you do not have nearly as much as you think you have. Even things like being able to look and see who your employees are and what their career paths have done, and then compare your career pathing of your own employees against other companies. A lot of people think you need the records of individual companies in order to be able to do that. No, you don't. I can go out and answer those questions right now. Even if I wasn't the CEO of a big data market intelligence firm, I could go out and answer those questions right now, because all I got to do is go to a site like LinkedIn, where a huge proportion of individuals have their careers mapped out in LinkedIn. And if you look at enough individuals in an organization and then you look at their career histories, you start to weave together a picture, and then you layer onto that things like gender or ethnicity, and now you start to get really interesting views of how effectively are people managing inclusive workforces and how are they managing their turnover and things. And all of those are just examples of transparency that already exists. Most people don't realize it, and most people, frankly, don't know how to take advantage of that, but it exists. So the more that you can lean into that fact and lead in a way that does not depend on keeping away from transparency around pay or hiring or career practices, things like that, the more effective you're going to be. It's just a more genuine and honest environment, and that pays off in spades with the relationship that you have with your workforce.
I think that's a fantastic note to wrap up on. How can people find you and WageScape if they want to learn more?
Well, we're easy. You can find us. You can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn.
All right. Fantastic. Cary Sparrow, thank you so much for making time to share your work and insights with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Fund the People podcast. Visit fundthepeople.org and click on podcast to find the show notes and resources from this and other episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd really appreciate a 5-star rating and a quick review or comment in your podcast app of choice. It helps more people to find the show. To get the extended version of this interview, plus lots of bonus content, I invite you to join our Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/fundthepeople to subscribe today. Thank you for the work you do. Remember to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another.